Hi guys, in this video we are going to look at Module 20, which is all about community ecology. So in class we've been looking at population ecology, so now we're going to take that and apply it to the community level. So looking at community ecology, what it is looking at the interactions between species. So these are going to show us various symbiotic relationships. So symbiotic relationships are something that you are going to look at within your microcosm. So make sure that you start jotting down some notes as you go through these slides here. So symbiotic relationships show the relationships between two species that live within close relationship to one another. So when we study community ecology, what we're looking at are symbiotic relationships. So we are going to go through the 6 types of symbiotic relationships. The first is going to be competition. So competition is when you have two individuals struggling over a shared limited resource, or it can be two species struggling over a shared limited resource. But regardless, they're going to be competing over the same thing. So there are 2 different principles that we're going to look at here. The first is the competitive exclusion principle. And really these are just models. These are ideas of what we think species or individuals will do when they're competing over the same thing. So the competitive exclusion principle states that if 2 species are competing for the same limiting resource, they cannot coexist. That's what this one says. So one's going to outcompete the other, and the other is going to die and cease to exist. So either you win or you die. So this scientific study here kind of looked at this, and it looked at 2 different paramecium species. So these are little bacteria. So they grew one of them, and they saw them, first of all, they grew them separately, and they watched their growth pattern here. So here you have that logistic growth model, where you have your 0, you have your S-shaped curve, and they level off at that carrying capacity. And then in the third petri dish, they put them both together, and they tried to see which one would outcompete the other, because their limited resource there was going to be food. So you can see here, they both start growing in the beginning, but soon that Paramecium aurelia is going to outcompete the Paramecium caudatum and drive it to extinction. And then it can continue to live. So competition in this competitive exclusion principle can be interspecies or even intraspecies. So interspecies means between 2 different species. Intraspecies is within the same species. So we see this a lot of time when you talk about like territorial, especially when you have like these male bighorn sheep fighting. So they're fighting over who's the leader of their herd, or they can fight over reproductive partners. Here you have birds fighting with this little groundhog or prairie dog over a food resource. That's going to be interspecies. Lions and hyenas, interspecies. This pug with this fish, just funny. So we have another type of competition principle where there's no death. And we call this resource partitioning. So this is when you have 2 species that usually use the same resource, but instead they're going to find a way to divide it, or they themselves are going to evolve. So the perfect example of resource partitioning is going to be with Darwin's finches. So remember, they all originally probably ate the same exact seed, but then all of these different species of finch realized that there wasn't enough for all of them. So some of them began to evolve to have longer beaks, or some of them evolved to have shorter beaks. So there are different types of resource partitioning. So the first type of resource partitioning is going to be temporal resource partitioning. So temporal is time. So an example of this would be wolves and coyotes that live within the same ecosystem. They're going to choose different times to hunt. So they're not trying to hunt at the same time. And likely, if they're hunting at different times, their prey is going to be different as well. Another example of temporal resource partitioning is going to be plants that are pollinated at different times of the year. So if you're really into gardening, you might know that there are different crops that you'll plant at different times of the year, because that's when their natural pollinators are going to be there. Same thing with flowers. I think a really great example right now that we're in the fall season is mums. It's mum season. So that's the type of flower that thrives right now, because that's when its pollinators are active. The second type is going to be spatial resource partitioning. So this is when they are going to start utilizing different habitats. So this could be one deciding to put their One species of bird trying to put their nest in a lower canopy of the tree, while a different species is going to be in the upper canopy of the forest. Or another really interesting example happens below ground with plant roots. So it's really common for plants to have evolved, so their roots go to different levels of the soil. So you have your plant over here on the right side with really shallow roots, and it's going to get a lot of that fresh rainwater. That's where it's going to get the majority of its water. Whereas other plants will have these deep root systems, and they're going to take water from deeper and nutrients from deeper within the ground. Our third type of resource partitioning is morphological resource partitioning, also known as evolution. So when I very first introduced resource partitioning, this is what I mentioned, these Darwin's finches, which is that morphological resource partitioning. So they decided to evolve so they weren't competing over the same exact resource anymore. So again, these are all types of ways that competition can exist without anything necessarily dying. Our next type of symbiotic relationship is predation. So this is an interaction when one animal kills and consumes the other animal. So at the top of that, you have an apex predator. So an apex predator is one that is the absolute top of the food chain. So this is something that you would think of with like lions, orca whales. Humans are an apex predator. Great white sharks, apex predators. So those are the predation. Again, one lives and consumes, the other one dies. A really interesting example of a predator is going to be a parasitoid. So parasitoids are parasites, but it's not parasitism. So a parasitoid is a type of predator. It's going to lay its eggs inside of its host. So it's going to choose a host and lay its eggs inside of it. And it's called a host where they lay their eggs. So it sounds like super alien stuff right there. But essentially they're going to feed on that host. And that's why it becomes predation. So to avoid predation, a lot of prey have evolved different defenses. So first we're going to look at animal ones because later we'll talk about plant defenses. So things like skunks that spray their spray, porcupines that have their needles, different animals can camouflage. You see that all over the place with butterflies, with chameleons, with other lizard species, crazy sounds to scare off animals, and then sometimes poison. So things like poison dart frogs. Or you have other really interesting defenses like this albatross. It's this bird species that has evolved where they can sleep while flying, because when they're flying, they're safer from predators. So predation can seem really sad, especially when you look at nature and you're like, oh no, that cute little animal was killed. But it's important. Predation is really important in the circle of life, and it helps keep different herbivorous animals or primary consumers in check, because without predation, we would run into situations where we might have overgrazing. So our next symbiotic relationship is going to be parasitism. So this is when one organism is going to live on or in another organism. So this is an example of a parasite that lives within the mouth of a fish. So again, in this situation, one benefits and one is harmed. So a type of parasite is going to be a pathogen. And a pathogen is a parasite that's going to cause disease within its host. So COVID would be technically considered a pathogen, even though it's a virus and people don't really consider viruses a living thing. Or E. coli. E. coli is probably a better example. That's a bacteria and it's a parasite, so it's going to cause disease within its host. So a single parasite rarely will kill an individual. Usually it'll be a group once they reproduce inside of it. Our next type of symbiotic relationship is going to be herbivory. So herbivory is an interaction when an animal consumes a producer. So again, just like predation, one lives and one dies. So when herbivores become too abundant, they can have dramatic effects on producers. This is kind of what we were talking about with the importance of predation. So you're going to have far too many producers, or you're going to have too many. When you have too many primary consumers, you are going to run into the risk of wiping out a plant species. So to protect themselves, plants have evolved defenses too. So for example, cacti and a lot of succulents produce thorns to protect themselves, and there are also some plants that are poisonous to eat. Next is mutualism. So mutualism is an interaction between species where they both benefit, and it's going to increase survival for both of them. So it's kind of like that creepy old saying, like that you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Creepy, but very actually true. So great examples of this are going to be any pollinator and then the plant that they pollinate. So the pollinator is going to get a food resource, and then the plant is going to have a way of spreading its seed as well. Other examples, a lot of fish will have benefits. They'll live within coral reefs, and then they'll give benefits to that as well. Or like this bird species with this alligator, you'll see this sometimes. And so really what you have here is this bird that's benefiting, and the alligator is going to be benefiting as well. Our last symbiotic relationship is going to be commensalism. So this is when one species benefits and the other one has no effect. It doesn't help them, it doesn't hurt them either. So an example of this would be this squirrel species, even though this you could maybe argue as mutualism. So you have this species of squirrel living within a hole of the tree. The tree is not harmed, but the squirrels benefit from this. Or a lot of the time you'll have these fish species swimming alongside these sharks. So this fish species is not the main prey of this shark, but the shark protects them. The shark doesn't care that they're there. It is what it is, but these fish benefit from that interaction. So again, commensalism, one is helped, the other one doesn't care. So let's review this really fast. Competition, both are hurt. Predation, one benefits, one dies. Parasitism, one benefits, one is harmed. Herbivory, one benefits, one dies. Mutualism, both benefit. Commensalism, one benefits, nothing happens to the other one. So looking at interactions with species, there are some species that will have a greater impact on an ecosystem than others. We call these keystone species. So keystone species are species that play far more importance in a community than its abundance or its population density might suggest. So they might be small in numbers, but their impacts are huge. A lot of the time, these keystone species will also be ecosystem engineers. So an ecosystem engineer is a keystone species that creates or maintains habitats for others. Perfect example of that is going to be beavers that build their dams. So they're going to regulate water flow, they're going to create ecosystems for themselves, and they're also going to create ecosystems for others as well. Another really great example of a keystone species are wolves in Yellowstone. So we'll look more at this next semester in class, or actually maybe even this semester a little bit. So in Yellowstone, for a while, wolves went extinct because they would always go towards the outside where there was all this farmland, and they were killed eventually. Once the wolves were out of Yellowstone, the elk started to overproduce and they were overgrazing. So originally, wolves were seen as a pest. But once they were gone, we realized their importance and realized that they were a keystone species. They were the ones that helped regulate the population density of all the other species that were living within Yellowstone National Park. So this is all that we have for Module 20, and it's time to move on to Module 21.